Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about this morning with you guys is probably not as common of a topic, but we've got some room in the schedule, and so I thought I would bring it to you. And it is the problem of religious language, okay? The problem of religious language. Now, this isn't going to come up nearly as often from skeptics as other problems, like, for instance, the problem of evil. I mean, if you get in a conversation with a non-Christian, an atheist, the problem of evil is probably going to come up within the first few minutes. But the problem of religious language is a bigger issue maybe in academia. So among theologians, among philosophers, this problem of religious language you will see eventually if you dive into this area of ministry, apologetics, and philosophy. So it's similar to the problem of evil in that a skeptic is going to bring it to us and say, hey, your belief system seems to have internal contradictions. So that's kind of what's going on with the problem of evil, right? If a skeptic, if you came to the debate at UNL, which will eventually get on YouTube, but the one in Texas is already on YouTube, so you can watch that one. But the problem of evil didn't come up in my Texas debate. But last Wednesday at UNL, the problem of evil became a big part of the debate. And that's what's being done with the problem of evil, is that the skeptic is saying, hey, in your belief system, you seem to have a contradiction. And we know contradictions can't be true, and so we've got to address the problem of evil. Well, similarly, the problem of religious language is a problem that the skeptic is bringing to us and saying, hey, your belief system has this internal contradiction. It has this problem. And so this is our response then to the problem of religious language. So what is the problem? Well, it has to do with the difficulty of describing a supposedly infinite God with finite human language. So this is often how the problem is presented to us. They're saying, you claim that there's this infinite God out there, but how is it that if there's this infinite God, that you can describe that infinite God with finite human language? We've discussed this morning all the difficulties there is with human language, right? There's human language isn't absolute. It's very flexible. It changes. The meaning of words change. And so there's a lot of problem with human language. It's finite, for one, but there's also a lot of other problems when it comes to communication and using human languages. So the way this is presented is that it's very difficult for finite language to describe an infinite God. Even some might say it's impossible to do so. So this is kind of how it's presented. They will say the idea of an infinite being just doesn't make any sense. This has to do kind of with the coherence of theism. Your belief system doesn't even, it's not coherent. It's incoherent. How could there be an infinite being? What does that even mean? And then, this is more directly the problem of religious language, is even if there is an infinite being, even if there was one, we could never know anything about such a being because our minds are limited and our language is limited. It's finite. So how could our finite language describe an infinite being? It doesn't make any sense to try to even talk about such an infinite being because all such God talk is meaningless nonsense. This topic did come up in my debate in Florida a couple of years ago. I debated an atheist, Dan Barker, at an atheist conference, and that debate is up on YouTube. But he did bring up this issue of incoherence, the idea of infinity, an infinite being incoherent. So it is something to think about and discuss, and it is connected to the idea of inspiration, because remember, if in inspiration, we're claiming that this infinite being communicated to us using finite language. But how could that be? How could an infinite being communicate with finite language, and how could finite language ever describe an infinite being? So this might be the first time you've ever been exposed to this problem. Again, it's not nearly as commonplace as the problem of evil. Now, this is one of those issues that seems easy to solve at first, but the more you think about it, the more you realize how this actually is a difficult issue. And various Christians, various theologians down through the centuries have addressed this issue in different ways. And I can't say that there's one solution that is completely problem-free, okay? So I'm going to present probably the three main positions on this issue that Christians have taken down through the centuries. But I'll also point out that every position has some, at least, unanswered questions concerning it. So, if you're new to this might just sound easy because it's something we do all the time. We talk about God all the time, and so it seems natural and easy for us. But once you start thinking about who and what God is and all the problems with finite human language, if you've done any sort of communication studies, you realize that, man, human language is so difficult and that causes so much miscommunication. There's so many problems and difficulties with human language. So if you've done any sort of communication studies, that might give you more of an understanding why this is a difficult topic. So the three main positions are as follows. So some would say our God talk, our language of God, is univocal. The second position is that our God talk, when we use words to describe God, they are equivocal. And then the last one is analogous. So we've only got about 10 minutes left, so let me just quickly summarize these three positions. And I would fall in the third camp. I would say our God talk is analogous. So if you aren't able to go through all the details, I've got longer lectures about this on the YouTube channel. If you're interested, just know that my position is the third one. So let's just run through them real quick. So some would make the case that our God talk is univocal. There's a sense in which this position just kind of rejects the problem. So this position says, look, our words, when we describe God, they mean exactly the same thing when we use them as when we refer to God with these words. So, simple example, when I say that my friend Bob is a good guy, and then I say that God is a good God, there's no difference at all between those two senses of good. So God is good and Bob is good. And so this position would say, I'm using the word good in the exact same sense, and there's no difference. So univocal. You can think of unity. There's a unity between those two uses of the word good. There's a unity that they mean the exact same thing. Now, some in this camp would take kind of you could call it maybe a Platonic position, in that these ideas were given to us by God. And so when we're expressing these ideas, God's goodness, we're using human language to express ideas that God has given in our mind. And so we're actually using God's ideas about himself. So this is in their position, those who take this position, that's how they're capturing infinity, the infinite, God's infinite goodness, even in our language. And they don't have a problem with that, because they're saying that these ideas ultimately about God's goodness come from God, and obviously he knows his infinite goodness, and then he gives us those ideas directly in our mind, so there's a one-to-one match between what we're saying and God's ideas about himself. Now, as you can imagine, there's problems with this univocal position. It does seem difficult to try to make the case that words apply exactly the same. I mean, you might have even felt that when I said, yeah, Bob is good and God is good. You're probably thinking, well, yeah, but there's a difference between God and Bob, right? Yes, there is. And that would be the pushback against this position, that Bob is this finite being, and yes, he's good in a sense, but definitely not good in the sense that God is. And so people who push back against this position will argue that this Platonic model just doesn't work. For one reason is that our language isn't fixed. Even if there are these Platonic universals, these Platonic ideas, our words aren't directly connected to them because our language is flexible, and so we don't have this one-to-one relationship between these perfections, these universals, I'm using Platonic language here, and our words. So the classic example is the word bark. If there is a universal or an absolute truth of the noise a dog makes, in our language, we use bark to refer to that universal, but we also use bark to refer to other things, like the stuff on the side of trees. And so even if there are these universal perfections, these ideas in God's mind that He gives us, our language is not directly associated to them in a one-to-one sense. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide just for sake of time. It's just a popular argument against the univocal position. The next position is the equivocal position. And it's notorious for me to get these mixed up. I have a terrible memory. So if you're like me and you need like little helps to help you remember things, the Q here is what it reminds me. The Q is, I think of as not quite. Okay, so this would be the position that our language can't describe God at all. So there's no, our words mean quite different things. They have no similarity at all. So again, using Bob as the example, when we say that Bob is a good guy, my friend Bob's a good guy, and when we say that God is good, there is no similarity at all between those two senses of the word good. In fact, it's like we're using different words. There's so much difference between Bob's goodness and God's goodness that it doesn't even make sense to use the same word. We just have to because our human language is finite. But we could use different words because what we're describing in Bob and in God is just so radically different, quite different. So that Q might help you remember the name of this position, equivocal. So this position is quite interesting in that it says we can't describe God. So if the prior positions just said, hey, there's no problem here whatsoever, we can just describe God using our language, a one-to-one relationship. This position goes to the other extreme and says we can't even begin to describe God. And interestingly enough, a lot of theologians down through the centuries have taken this position to say that we can't describe God. Our God talk doesn't really describe Him. And so you see this in the history of Christianity, people talking about how our language can't describe what God is like. It can only describe what God is not like. This was referred to in the medieval times as the way of negation. We can't describe what God is like, only what God is not like. So this is a very common position in the medieval era. But even in the 1900s, there was a wing of theology called neo-orthodoxy. Not a fan. But the neo-orthodox theologians in the 1900s, they took a similar position here and said that our God talk can't describe God, it can only describe our subjective experiences that we have with God. So a big name in like neo-orthodoxy would be, you could even call it Karl Barth, the father of neo-orthodoxy. Again, not a fan, but just so you know, this isn't just a position taken in the medieval era. Even within the 1900s, people took this position. Of course, there's all sorts of problems with this equivocal position, right? If our God talk was equivocal, we couldn't say anything about God. We couldn't know God. This just has all sorts of difficulties in it. Even, to some of the medieval theologians, whom I love and have a lot of respect for, it just doesn't seem their way of negation was very logical. Because whenever you negate something, you are saying something positive. So when you say that God's not a liar, that's the way of negation, you're implying that God is truthful. And so even they're trying to get away from saying direct things about God, but you can't really avoid that. So then the last one is the analogous position. And this would be my position, and this is fairly common. There would be an explanation here that there is some similarity. Okay, so when we say that Bob is good, and then we say that God is good, we're not saying there's a one-to-one relationship between those two senses of good, but there is a relationship. So it's not, think of the other two positions as extremes. One would say there's a direct one-to-one relationship between those two senses of the word good, and the other one would say that there's no connection whatsoever. This would be more of a middle ground position that would say there's a similarity or resemblance situation going on here, where the goodness of Bob isn't exactly the same as the goodness of God, but there is a relationship there, a relation of resemblance, a relation of similarity. So, in other words, Bob's goodness does resemble God's goodness. And this makes sense, I think, in terms of being made in God's image. There are certain ways that we resemble God. And so I think you might see how this connects back to my divine love theory, where I want to argue that we can resemble God in the things that we do. Not exactly, but we can resemble Him. One of the reasons is because we were made in His image. Now there are problems with the analogous position, and this is the last slide that we'll put up on the board this morning. There are problems with it. It doesn't, like most things, it doesn't solve all the issues, but I think this is the most solid position. Of course, the two extremes don't like it. They both see the other extreme kind of hidden in this position. And this is, this happens in everything, politics or theology, where somebody in the middle gets accused from both ends of being more towards the other end, right? So the extreme positions, of course, don't like that. The equivocal folks say that the analogous people are just sneaking in the univocal language, and the opposite, the univocal position, says that this analogous position leads to the same sort of skepticism and agnosticism about God that the equivocal position leads to. So this is just the beginning of the conversation. This one's a little bit more heady, and again, if you're not used to it, this might just be the beginning of your dive into this conversation. But if you find it interesting, if you find this is something that you're interested in, there's all sorts of resources. Talk to me or just do a search online, and you can find good solid people talking about this and thinking through this issue. Even if it's something that you don't struggle with, there are folks that do struggle with it, either Christians or skeptics. And so, like all of this stuff we're doing in the class, we want to be ready to be able to give an answer for the hope that is within us.